In the late 19th century, the United States was awash in new money. Railroads stitched the country together, mines yielded unimaginable riches, and trust companies and stock exchanges conjured fortunes on speculation. Magnates built mansions that seemed to float above ordinary concerns, and families looked out over lawns and fountains, believing their dynasties would last forever. Yet for a handful of these Gilded Age families, the same forces that gave them opulence would soon take it away in a hurry. Their palaces hid secrets of risky deals, speculation, and hubris, and the wealth evaporated almost as quickly as it had appeared. This is the saga of the Gilded Age families who lost everything overnight, a tale of silver kings whose mines went worthless, of bank presidents who watched panicked depositors empty vaults, of industrial heirs who squandered fortunes on parties and horses, of media barons who mortgaged castles to maintain art collections, and of philanthropists who literally sold their jewels to keep their dreams alive. To understand how fragile the world of Gilded Age wealth could be, look first at the house that once symbolized American capitalism itself, the Vanderbilt Mansion. Cornelius Commodore Vanderbilt built a shipping and railroad empire worth about $100 million by the time he died in 1877, making him the richest man in the United States. His children inherited the fortune and immediately transformed it into lavish lifestyles. William Henry Vanderbilt expanded the New York Central Railroad, but also doubled his father's fortune in under 8 years. His sons, Cornelius II and William Kissam, commissioned French chateaux and Italian palazzi along Fifth Avenue, Newport, and Long Island. Cornelius II spent a reported $7 million building the Breakers in Newport, a 70-room limestone palace with imported marble, gold leaf, and murals. William Kissam's wife, Alva, built Marble House, lined with 500,000 cubic feet of marble. These summer cottages required dozens of servants and consumed enormous amounts of coal just to heat and light. The extravagance was staggering, but the investments were not as secure as they seemed. William Henry's sons were far better at spending than making money. Within a generation, they sold off shares of the family railroad, and by the 1970s, there were no Vanderbilt millionaires. One article about the family's decline notes that Reginald Vanderbilt squandered his inheritance on gambling and drinking. He allegedly lost $70,000 in a single night on his 21st birthday and died of cirrhosis, leaving debts and only a $5 million trust for his daughter. At a Vanderbilt family reunion in 1973, a reporter asked whether any of the 120 descendants present were millionaires. None raised their hands. The fortune had simply disappeared. The causes included poor business decisions, lavish spending, and the sale of New York Central shares as the railroad era gave way to automobiles and airlines. By 1947, every Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue had been demolished. For a family that once eclipsed the U.S. Treasury in wealth, the loss of everything happened over just a few decades. What looked like a permanent empire crumbled with surprising speed when heirs treated the fortune like a bottomless well. While the Vanderbilts watched their wealth trickle away through generations, other fortunes vanished in a single mad week. In October 1907, Montana copper magnate F. Augustus Heinze attempted to corner the market on United Copper Company stock. Heinze had made a fortune from Butte's copper mines and sold his shares for $12 million in 1906. He moved to New York, bought a bank, and joined the board of several trust companies. When his brothers tried to manipulate United Copper's stock price, a competitor exploited their exposed position. The scheme collapsed on October 15, 1907, causing share prices to plummet. Silent runs began on Heinz's bank and the Knickerbocker Trust, which had also financed the deal. Heinz was forced to resign as president of Mercantile National Bank and lost his standing in New York society. Depositors panicked and withdrew their money from the trusts. One of Heinz's brothers later wrote that the clearinghouse refused to help, and Knickerbocker Trust had to close its doors. Its president, Charles T. Barney, shot himself that night. In just a few days, the speculators lost their empire and triggered the Panic of 1907, one of the worst financial crises in U.S. history. Heinz returned to Montana to find his mining ventures collapsed. His relationships with his brothers were destroyed, and his health deteriorated. In 1914, at just 44, he died of a stomach hemorrhage caused by cirrhosis. Here was a man who had cashed out of a fortune worth tens of millions only to lose it all through greed and speculation. The collapse of his bank also ruined numerous depositors and underscored how a single misjudged gamble could wipe out fortunes overnight. The story of Charles T. Barney illustrates the human cost of the same crash. Barney was president of the Knickerbocker Trust Company, one of New York's largest trust institutions. Together with Heinz and speculator Charles W. Morse, he agreed to participate in the United Copper cornering scheme. When the price manipulation failed, depositors learned of Knickerbocker's involvement and began withdrawing funds. On October 21, 1907, the Trust's board asked Barney to resign. The National Bank of Commerce announced it would no longer clear checks for Knickerbocker. The next day, a massive run forced the trust to suspend operations, and the failure became a keystone of the Panic of 1907. Barney still had about $2.5 million in assets, enough to remain wealthy, yet his reputation was ruined. On the morning of November 14, 1907, he went to his bedroom, put a .32 caliber pistol to his abdomen, and shot himself. He died later that day as surgeons tried to save him. Here was a man who still possessed considerable wealth, but could not live with the disgrace of having destroyed his bank and his social standing. His suicide and the panic served as catalysts for reforming the financial system and eventually led to the creation of the Federal Reserve. The overnight collapse of trust companies like Knickerbocker illustrated how quickly Gilded Age fortunes could evaporate under the pressure of speculation and public panic. Not all fortunes vanished on Wall Street. In the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, a silver baron named Horace Tabor saw his wealth disappear because of a stroke of legislative pen. Tabor began as a prospector and storekeeper in Leadville. He hit it big in 1878 when he grub-staked two miners who discovered the Little Pittsburgh mine, and he parlayed his earnings into ownership of the Matchless mine. Tabor divorced his wife of 25 years and married a beautiful, scandalous young divorcee named Elizabeth Baby Doe McCourt. The couple became notorious for their lavish lifestyle. They built the Tabor Opera House, showered friends with champagne, and commissioned a mansion in Denver. In March 1893, however, the U.S. Congress repealed the Sherman Silver Purchase Act to prevent inflation. The price of silver collapsed almost overnight, and Tabor's holdings, including the Matchless mine, became practically worthless. According to History Colorado, the Tabors went from being one of the richest families in the country to struggling to afford food for their children. Denounced as opportunists by Denver society, they sold most of their possessions. Horace took work as a common mine worker and later as Denver's postmaster to support his family. He never regained his fortune. He fell ill and died in April 1899. On his deathbed, he told Baby Doe to hold on to the Matchless mine, believing it would one day make their daughters rich. She took his words literally, For the next 35 years, Baby Doe mortgaged the mine repeatedly, sold her jewelry, and struggled to find investors. But each venture failed. She ultimately moved into a one-room shack on the mine property in Leadville, living on bread and suet and the generosity of townspeople. In March 1935, a snowstorm engulfed the town, and she was found frozen to death on her cabin floor. Baby Doe's story, from rags to riches to rags again, underscores how government policy can suddenly render once valuable assets worthless and drive families from ballrooms to cabins within a decade. Another set of victims came not from speculation or policy, but from the slow grind of economic collapse. Edward T. Stotesbury was a partner at Drexel and Company and J.P. Morgan and Company. By the 1920s, his wealth was estimated at over $100 million. With his second wife, Ava, he embarked on a building spree that symbolized the zenith of Gilded Age extravagance. They built White Marsh Hall outside Philadelphia, a 147-room Palladian palace filled with 18th-century British portraits, El Mirasol in Palm Beach, a Spanish-style villa, and Wingwood House in Bar Harbor, a summer home with 80 rooms and arcaded galleries. The houses had switchboard operators who alerted the butler when automobiles entered the gate, motion picture theaters, imported marble fireplaces, and entire drawing rooms transplanted from European mansions. Then came the Great Depression. The stock market crash of 1929 cut income from Stotesbury's investments. Art markets collapsed, and operating costs of the estates ballooned. According to one account, the Depression took its toll even on the Stotesbury fortune. When he died in 1938, he left only about $10 million, roughly $100 million in today's dollars, which was barely enough to maintain 3 palatial households. White Marsh Hall was shuttered and sold to a chemical company. His widow moved out. Wingwood's contents were auctioned. The estate was sold to a buyer who could not afford it and abandoned. In 1953, the Canadian National Railway purchased the site and declared that no one was interested in maintaining such palaces anymore. Wingwood was demolished. Within 15 years, Bar Harbor's great estates, including Wingwood and neighboring mansions like Hotterrev and the Willows, were gone. The Stotesburys' lavish world dissolved under the pressures of economic depression and changing social values. Their story illustrates how even a vast fortune can shrink quickly when markets collapse and taxes and maintenance costs overwhelm income. The mansions that once embodied permanence vanished almost as fast as the fortunes that built them. Even those who seemed invincible were not immune. William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper baron, once wielded a media empire spanning dozens of newspapers, magazines, radio stations, and film studios. With his fortune, he built the opulent Hearst Castle at San Simeon, imported entire rooms from European abbeys and castles, and filled warehouses with art and antiquities. He lived with actress Marion Davies and continued to expand his collections even during the Depression. Hearst also used his newspapers to wage political campaigns, including a crusade against Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. Strikes and boycotts of his properties cut into revenues, yet he refused to reduce costs and continued his expensive art purchases. By the mid-1930s, his financial advisors discovered he was tens of millions of dollars in debt and unable to pay even the interest on his loans. To avert bankruptcy, he mortgaged San Simeon to Los Angeles Times owner Harry Chandler for $600,000. He sold real estate and large pieces of his art collection. Marion Davies sold her jewelry and took out loans to raise cash for him. She even lent Hearst $1 million. The trustees cut his salary and his annual dividends, and he sold exotic animals from his private zoo. Auctioneers combed through warehouses full of tapestries, paintings, furniture, and silver. His collections were sold in the late 1930s at a loss because the art market had not recovered. Time magazine reported that Hearst was at risk of defaulting on his San Simeon mortgage and losing it to Chandler. Although he avoided formal bankruptcy and regained profitability during World War II, he spent years on the brink of ruin. His near collapse demonstrates how even enormous cash flows can vanish when ego and extravagance outrun revenue. For Leland and Jane Stanford, disaster did not come from speculation or spending, but from lawsuits and earthquakes. Leland Stanford amassed a fortune as a railroad baron and used it with his wife to establish Stanford University in memory of their son. When he died in 1893, the family fortune faced a massive $15 million lawsuit from the federal government related to claims against his estate for money owed to the government. The Panic of 1893 simultaneously dried up credit, making it difficult to meet expenses. Most of the university's trustees wanted to close the school until finances could be sorted out. Jane Stanford insisted that the university remain open, even though its assets were frozen. She sold personal jewelry and directed trustees to auction her collection to create a library endowment. The so-called Jewel Fund, initially valued at $500,000, financed book purchases. She also transferred $30 million in personal assets to the university before her death, a massive sum that kept the institution afloat. Jane resisted cost-cutting in other areas. She spent lavishly on memorial buildings and implemented eccentric policies for students. But her determination and generosity saved the university from collapse. When the lawsuit was dropped in 1895, the university declared a holiday in celebration. Without her intervention, the Panic of 1893 might have closed the doors of one of today's most prestigious universities. The Stanford story illustrates both the vulnerability of even philanthropic fortunes and the power of purposeful giving to prevent a disaster. Jane would die in 1905 under mysterious circumstances. Some believe she was poisoned, but by then the university had survived its near collapse and begun to forge its own identity. While the Stanfords were saving their university, another Gilded Age fortune collapsed in a very public scandal. In 1890, Horace and Augusta Tabor's story had already become a national sensation. Horace divorced his first wife and married Baby Doe in a scandalous ceremony, attended by President Chester Arthur. They built a 10-bedroom mansion in Denver, decorated their daughter's nursery with gold, and spent $30,000 on a single diamond necklace. Their matchless mine produced $80,000 a month, which allowed them to host theatrical tours and European vacations. When the silver market crashed, the Tabor's friends melted away. Augusta Tabor, Horace's ex-wife, had invested more prudently and remained wealthy, watching from afar as her former husband returned to manual labor. Baby Doe's stubborn refusal to sell the mine or move away became the stuff of legend. She believed a newspaper prophecy that told her she would die at the Matchless. Her daughters eventually left and married. She turned away suitors and investors, focusing entirely on the mine. Her hair turned white, and she earned the nickname Mad Woman of Matchless, walking the streets of Leadville in tattered clothes. People who had once envied her fashions now pitied her. Her death in poverty in 1935 served as a grim bookend to a life that had been a living opera. The Tabor's spectacular rise and fall illustrate that wealth built on a single commodity is dangerously vulnerable to political shifts. When Congress repealed a law, the American dream crashed like a shaft in a mine. The Panic of 1907 not only destroyed bankers, it also upended the lives of depositors. When the Knickerbocker Trust suspended operations, Small businesses could not meet payroll. Factories closed and thousands of workers were laid off. Men who had spent decades saving found themselves destitute. In New York, some depositors mobbed the doors of other trusts and banks, triggering a domino effect. The episode revealed how much personal fortunes were tied to the stability of unregulated financial institutions. The panic's ripple effects reached across the country, bankrupting firms that had no connection to United Copper or F. Augustus Heinze. Historians often credit J.P. Morgan's last-minute interventions for preventing a total collapse of the banking system. He convened bankers in his library, locked the doors, and forced them to pledge funds to support teetering institutions. Yet the damage to individual fortunes and reputations was permanent. Bank President Charles T. Barney's suicide left his family and social circle reeling. Heinz's exoneration in court did not repair his ruined health or the lost trust of investors. The panic stands as a cautionary tale about the perils of leveraging and speculation in a system without a lender of last resort. Generational decline took a more leisurely but no less destructive course within the Vanderbilt family. When Commodore Vanderbilt died, he left his fortune almost entirely to his eldest son, William Henry, who doubled it through shrewd management. But the second generation split the fortune among multiple heirs. William Kissam Vanderbilt, after building grand houses and winning yacht races, retired from business and left management to outside investors. George Washington Vanderbilt sank much of his inheritance into building the Biltmore Estate, a 175,000 square foot French chateau in North Carolina that consumed his wealth. Without new investments, the railroad business stagnated. By the time the New York Central Railroad was sold in the early 20th century, the family had relinquished its main income stream. Their Fifth Avenue mansions were demolished and replaced with office towers. Even the famous Petit Chateau at 665th Avenue came down in 1926. The Vanderbilt story is not of a single cataclysm, but of 1,000 cuts. Generational splits, lavish consumption, and failure to adapt to new industries. It shows that even the largest fortunes can dissolve when heirs lack a cohesive strategy. Not all wealthy families lost money. Some simply lost their heirs. Peter A. B. Widener, the Philadelphia transit and tobacco magnate, built Linwood Hall, an imposing 110-room mansion, to showcase his art collection of Rembrandts and Chinese porcelains. Widener's eldest son George and grandson Harry were among the wealthiest passengers on the RMS Titanic in 1912. When the ship struck an iceberg and sank, both men perished, along with 1,500 others. Widener's widow Eleanor used part of the family fortune to build the Harry Elkins Widener Library at Harvard University as a memorial to her son. The Widener fortune survived the tragedy, but the family line dwindled. Over the 20th century, taxes, philanthropy, and the dispersal of art collections reduced the estate. By 2005, when James Widener Ray died without heirs, the fortune had been whittled down to about $80 million, according to one report. Still substantial, but a fraction of the billions once controlled by Peter Widener. Linwood Hall fell into disrepair and changed hands multiple times. Its 110 rooms, built to display masterpieces, were stripped of art and furniture. In the 2020s, preservationists raised alarms about its decay, noting that fortunes may fade faster than walls. Not far away, another New York dynasty chose a very different path. The Wendell family amassed more than 150 Manhattan properties by following rigid rules: never mortgage, never sell, never repair, and always assume Broadway would move north. Their wealth rivaled the Vanderbilts, yet they lived like misers. Patriarch John G. Wendell II forbade his 6 sisters from marrying so no outsiders would claim the estate. They lived in an aging brownstone at 442 Fifth Avenue without electricity or telephones, earning the nickname House of Mystery. Summers were spent at their Irvington farm tending cows and chickens and wearing Victorian dresses. When the last sister, Ella, died in March 1931 with no heirs, more than 2,000 claimants surfaced. After years of litigation, the $100 million fortune was distributed to 5 charities, and Drew University received the Fifth Avenue mansion. In 1934, the house was demolished and replaced by a commercial building. The Wendells did not lose their fortune to a crash. They simply refused to embrace life, and when their line ended, their empire vanished overnight. Similarly, Clarence Mackay inherited a massive fortune from his father, John Mackay, whose Comstock Lode silver strike netted hundreds of millions. Clarence built Harbor Hill, a 688-acre estate on Long Island, complete with a palatial Stanford White House and numerous outbuildings. He served as chairman of Postal Telegraph and Cable Company and entertained kings, presidents, and opera stars. But as Time magazine noted in a 1938 obituary, the Depression gnawed away at the income from his tremendous fortune. Clarence continued to play godfather and guarantor to artistic institutions while revenues declined. He mortgaged property, sold art, and in later years withdrew from society. At his death in 1938, his fortune had shrunk dramatically. Harbor Hill passed to his son John, but was eventually sold. Vandals ruined the abandoned house during World War II. It was demolished, leaving only statues and retaining walls. The combination of economic downturn and high maintenance costs consumed yet another Gilded Age fortune. Clarence Mackay's misfortune was also self-inflicted. He inherited about $45 million and sold his father's company to International Telephone and Telegraph in 1928 for $300 million worth of stock. When the crash of 1929 hit, the stock fell from $149 to under $4, shrinking his holdings to about $6.9 million. He sold armor, art, and antiques to stay afloat, pawned silver and tapestries, and dismissed servants. Harbor Hill became a burden he could barely maintain, and after his death, the bank foreclosed. Vandals stripped the mansion, and it was eventually dynamited. Mackay learned too late that a fortune paid in stock can vanish just as easily as paper. The Great Depression wreaked havoc on many socialites. Joseph and Sissy Patterson of the Chicago Tribune family, for example, lost much of their wealth when real estate investments collapsed. In Florida, the luxury real estate boom at Palm Beach ended abruptly in 1926, when the Miami hurricane and subsequent market crash sent values plummeting. Banker John S. Phipps and his wife built Casa Bendita in Palm Beach, only to see fortunes reduced. Although they did not lose everything, they scaled back drastically and sold off properties. Stories like theirs illustrate the domino effect of global crises on personal fortunes. When markets crashed, even diversified portfolios faltered if built on leveraged or overvalued assets. Perhaps the most poignant example of almost losing everything for a cause is the story of Jane Stanford's determination to keep her university open. After the Panic of 1893, when the government's lawsuit froze the Stanford estate, she faced the prospect of paying professors with no income. She mortgaged personal property and sold her jewels. She transferred stock to the university and sought legal exemptions so the institution would not pay tax on its property. She insisted that faculty salaries be paid on time and refused to close, even when trustees argued that bankruptcy would be prudent. In the meantime, She imposed moral rules on students and shaped the campus according to her beliefs. When the lawsuit was dropped, Stanford University survived, but the personal fortune that had funded it was greatly diminished. In her will, she left nearly all her remaining assets to the university. Her actions highlight a different kind of risk: philanthropic commitment. Wealth tied to institutions can vanish quickly when founders prioritize mission over personal security. Economic crashes were not the only disasters that wiped out fortunes. Fires and accidents destroyed physical assets and undermined the wealth behind them. In November 1892, the original breakers, the wooden Queen Anne cottage built for Pierre Lorillard IV and later purchased by Cornelius Vanderbilt II, burned to the ground within hours. Only the children's cottage survived. Vanderbilt responded by building a fireproof masonry mansion, but the fire illustrated how quickly $1 million house could disappear. Likewise, in 1902, the Parsons Wentworth House at the Rockefeller Estate in Pocantico Hills burned due to defective electrical wiring. The family replaced it with Kaiquit, built with steel trusses and concrete tunnels to prevent another disaster. These episodes remind us that Gilded Age wealth was stored not just in stocks, but in vulnerable physical structures. A single spark could burn through it. As the 20th century progressed, tax policies and changing social values accelerated the dissolution of great estates. Federal income and estate taxes introduced in 1916 made it expensive to pass large fortunes across generations. Many heirs donated or sold their mansions rather than pay taxes. The Great Depression forced families like the Stotesburys and Hearsts to liquidate art collections. World War II further eroded fortunes as governments called for patriotic donations and rationing. Wealthy families lost domestic staff to military service. After the war, maintaining a 50-room mansion became socially unacceptable and economically untenable. In Newport, half of the Gilded Age cottages were demolished or converted to museums. In Philadelphia, the once formidable palaces of the Widener, Elkins, and Stotesbury families disappeared. On Long Island's Gold Coast, estates such as Harbor Hill and Oheka Castle were subdivided or repurposed. The combination of property taxes, labor costs, and dwindling business income forced sales. Fortunes that had seemed unassailable in 1890 were gone by 1950. Even when fortunes survived, the psychological toll could be severe. Many heirs suffered from what one psychiatrist calls sudden wealth syndrome, a sense of unworthiness and fear of losing money. Reginald Vanderbilt's gambling spree could be interpreted as an attempt to validate his identity through risk. Augustus Heinz's insistence on cornering copper may have been driven by a need to prove himself in New York's financial circles. The Tabors clung to the matchless mine, not just for financial reasons, but because it symbolized their love and their identity. Jane Stanford's iron grip on her university reflected her belief that she was acting on behalf of her deceased son. When wealth vanished, these individuals faced not just economic ruin but existential crises. Charles T. Barney's suicide was as much about shame as about money. Baby Doe's isolation at Leadville became a performance of martyrdom. William Randolph Hearst's refusal to sell his newspapers, even when he had to mortgage his castle and borrow from his mistress, suggests that his empire had become part of his identity. In many cases, the fortunes themselves were inseparable from the personalities of their owners. When the money disappeared, the person did too. No story better captures the whiplash of fortune than that of Jesse Livermore. The boy plunger made millions betting against railroad stocks in his 20s, and in 1929, he reportedly earned $100 million by shorting the market. He bought mansions, yachts, and jewels, but he never stopped gambling. After 1929, he kept speculating and losing. In 1934, he filed bankruptcy for the third time, listing assets of $84,000 against debts of $2.5 million, and was suspended from the Chicago Board of Trade. His wife sold their Great Neck house for a fraction of its cost. Livermore tried to reinvent himself as an investment advisor, but his luck never returned. On Thanksgiving Day, 1940, he entered the cloakroom of the Sherry Netherland Hotel and shot himself. In a note to his wife, he wrote that he was tired of fighting and felt he was a failure. For a man once considered the greatest trader alive, the collapse from hundreds of millions to suicide underscores how quickly speculative wealth can evaporate and how deeply personal identity can be tied to money. These examples from railroads and mines, telegraph companies, and real estate empires show that there was no single reason fortunes vanished. Some families were undone by greed and speculation, others by legislative changes, others by the slow erosion of inflation and taxes, still others simply by the passage of time and the lack of heirs. But one thread runs through all these stories: concentration. The Tabors tied their wealth to silver and lost it when silver lost its shine. The Mackays held their fortune in one stock and paid the price when that stock imploded. The Wendell siblings hoarded buildings but refused to invest in the next generation of people who would inhabit them. The Vanderbilts clung to railroads long after cars and planes had made rails less relevant. In every case, failing to diversify meant that the health of an entire dynasty depended on a single market or a single piece of infrastructure. When those pillars collapsed, there was nothing to cushion the fall. Another thread is secrecy. Gilded Age magnates often live behind closed gates, removed from the workers and customers whose labor made their fortunes possible. Their walls hid not only riches, but also fragilities, mechanical boilers that could explode, vaults filled with debt rather than cash, marriages that were brittle, sons and daughters whose sense of purpose had been smothered by money. The public saw the facades, the limestone porticos, the pedigreed horses and the social registers, but not the leveraged loans or the heirs who drank themselves to death. When crises came, the walls could not protect them. A run on a bank did not discriminate between the president and a factory worker waiting to cash his paycheck. A legislative act repealing the Silver Purchase Act did not pause to allow the Tabors to diversify. The 1929 crash did not slow down long enough for Clarence Mackay to sell his shares. There is a dark irony in the fact that families who had the resources to insulate themselves from nearly everything could not shield themselves from the consequences of their own choices. There is also the question of stewardship. Wealth, especially when inherited, carries obligations to employees, to communities, to culture. Some families rose to that responsibility. Jane Stanford spent down her fortune to keep a university open. Clarence Mackay donated his armor to museums. Eleanor Widener built a library for Harvard. Others viewed wealth as a means of self-indulgence, building bowling alleys in the attics of their cottages or racing steam yachts across the Hudson while their business empires deteriorated. The stories of fortunes lost overnight force us to ask whether the Gilded Age barons were trustees of capital or gamblers on a grand scale. The Panic of 1907 shows the damage that mismanagement can do when trust companies act like speculators. The sale of priceless art in the 1930s shows how quickly culture becomes commodity when debt collectors knock. The demolition of Whitemarsh Hall or Harbor Hill shows that communities do not always see value in preserving symbols of extravagance, especially when they are associated with excess and waste. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of these tales is how entwined money and identity become. The owners of these fortunes often define themselves by what they owned. The Breakers was not just a house, it was Cornelius Vanderbilt's statement of supremacy. Harbor Hill was not just an estate, it was the Mackay family's genealogical tree rendered in limestone. The Knickerbocker Trust was not just a bank, it was Charles Barney's reputation. When wealth disappeared, so did the sense of self. That is why Reginald Vanderbilt drank, why Jessie Livermore took a pistol to a hotel cloakroom, why Baby Doe refused to leave her shack, and why Jane Stanford clutched her jewel fund so tightly. In each case, losing money meant losing meaning. The pain was not simply financial, it was existential. Modern psychologists might recognize in these stories patterns of addiction, anxiety, and depression. The Gilded Age may have been gilded, but the people living in it were not immune to very human vulnerabilities. For readers today, these narratives offer caution, but also empathy. They remind us that behind every headline about a billion-dollar collapse lies a human story of miscalculation, trust, hope, and despair. They remind us that markets can destroy as quickly as they create. They also invite us to consider what losing everything truly means. Does it mean watching a bank book go to zero? Or does it mean watching one's name vanish from the lips of society, seeing a mansion torn down, or realizing that the children who were supposed to carry on a legacy have no interest in wealth? In the end, the Wendell sisters died wealthy but friendless. Clarence Mackay died with assets but without his house. The Tabors died poor but remembered. Jane Stanford died suspiciously, but her university thrives. Loss is relative, and sometimes the things worth holding on to are not the ones that glitter. There is a temptation to view these stories as schadenfreude, rich people receiving their comeuppance. But the tales of the Gilded Age families who lost everything overnight are more complex. They reveal how quickly economic and political forces can shift, turning paper wealth into dust. They show the fragility of systems built on speculation, commodity prices, or single industries. They illustrate the perils of ignoring diversification and the dangers of ego. They also highlight acts of courage and generosity. Jane Stanford selling her jewels to keep a university open. Baby Doe staying with her husband when everyone else abandoned him. Marion Davies selling her jewelry to save Hearst. The stories remind us that wealth is a tool, not a shield. A bank president can still be disgraced. A mining baron can still die in poverty. And they warn that fortunes built on the shifting sands of speculation or the vagaries of commodity markets can disappear almost overnight. As one walks through the ruins of Wingwood or the empty galleries of Linwood Hall, it is hard to imagine the garden parties and opera stars that once filled those spaces. The marble remains, and the linden trees still line the old drive. But the laughter and music are gone. In Leadville, tourists now visit the Matchless Mine and peer into the tiny cabin where Baby Doe died. In Manhattan, the site of the Knickerbocker Trust is now occupied by a skyscraper. Few passers-by know that the building's failure nearly toppled the nation's financial system. On San Simeon's terraces, visitors learn about Hearst's art collection and his brush with bankruptcy. At Stanford University, students benefit from a jewel fund created by a woman who sold her jewels so that they could have books. Each site tells a story of impermanence. The Gilded Age has long passed, but the cautionary tales endure. When we marvel at today's billionaires and their mega yachts, perhaps we should remember Baby Doe Tabor shivering in her cabin and Charles T. Barney on the floor of his bedroom. Fortunes may be measured in numbers, but the human stories behind them reveal their true worth and their fragility. Ultimately, The lost fortunes of the Gilded Age are not just curiosities of history. They are warnings. They teach that wealth without stewardship can dissolve quickly, that speculation can bring entire systems down, that social standing cannot protect against shame, and that philanthropy, though noble, can drain personal reserves. These stories also show that within every gilded facade, there may be cracks, hidden loans, fragile markets, or personal demons. The great houses of the Gilded Age still stand as museums and hotels, but they no longer belong to the families who built them. Their owners learned, sometimes overnight, that the difference between being a titan and being a legend can be a single bad investment, a single act of Congress, a single bank run, or a single market crash. The gilding flakes away to reveal that fortunes are as vulnerable as the people who hold them.